Jaune Evans, welcome back to the New School at Commonweal.
Thank you, Michael.
Jaune, you are a poet and visual artist. You were ordained a Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition in 1983 under the guidance of Bernie Glassman and Maizumi Roshi. You're now a Sangha member of Everyday Zen under the guidance of Norman Fischer Roshi. And you've worked in philanthropy and public service for over 25 years. You're now the managing director of the Tamalpais Trust in San Rafael, which supports indigenous-led organizations outside the United States in human rights, traditional knowledge, education, and indigenous rights, cultural integrity, protection of sacred lands and waters, and gender equity. You previously served as the managing director of the Tides Foundation and as executive director of the Lannan Foundation and executive director of the New Mexico Community Foundation. So it's fair to say that you know a little bit about philanthropy at this point.
I do.
Yeah. And you and I have been friends for, when did we first meet? Do you remember?
I think we met in 2009 when I first moved to the Bay Area. But I had admired you and the work at Commonweal for many years before, and I had been writing to Susan Braun to come try to work here before I got here in 2009.
And indeed you did work here for a while.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
And I will not disguise the fact that you are a beloved friend who I have admired and been grateful for. And as we said before we began, you actually recommended Oren Schlossberg to be our executive director, which
I did.
he is.
I did, and I was also present here the first time you ever did a spiritual biography with Orland Bishop.
That's right.
And I don't think there's a lack of connection between that and Oren Schlossberg. Somehow the tradition of beautiful people in this very mystical place has been something I've been able to be a part of for many years now.
So as we sit here today, what's on your heart?
This morning I was in Point Reyes and I was talking with the Sangha group that meets there on Friday mornings, and we were talking about the 5 things that have been big influences for me in my life as a spiritual practitioner and as a priest. And the first 4 things I heard, I don't know, 1979 or 80, as I was studying to be a priest, and they were to be humble, to practice not knowing, to treat everyone as the Buddha, and to bear witness to the suffering of the world and to care for the world. And in the years since, I had learned a 5th one from Leonard Cohen, forget your perfect offering.
Forget your
Perfect offering.
Oh, yeah.
There is a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. So that's what's on my heart this morning, is to forget being perfect and to just offer.
So let's go over those again slowly. The first is be humble.
Be humble.
All right. The second is
To be in I'm trying to say it in the whole way that my teacher once said it, but it's basically not to know. It's to
practice
stop
unknowing.
being a big knower, is what I think I said this morning. to be able to open to that the world isn't what you think it is. It's often so much better. And then the third one is to treat everyone as Buddha, and that includes yourself. And the fourth is to bear witness and bring your caring to everyone and everything in the world, which is to listen and sometimes to speak and sometimes to act.
And then the one you learned from Leonard Cohen?
Forget your perfect offering.
And the line that comes after that?
Well, in Cohen's song, the song Anthem, he says, there is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in.
Do you know the previous history of that line?
No.
Dame Edith Sitwell said of the poet William Blake, he was cracked, but it was through the crack that the light came. Now, it may well go back before that. I'm not sure that Dame Edith Sitwell made it up, but I know for a fact that she said it of William Blake. In fact, I knew that long before I heard that Leonard Cohen had said it, because it speaks to the heart of our work at Commonweal with Wounded Healers, which was the name that Bill Moyers gave the film that he made about the Commonweal Cancer Help Program. And of course, Wounded Healers are the essence of the shamanic tradition that go back to the beginning of time, that the shamans, as often women as men, speaking of gender equity and, traditional societies, were characteristically, in the studies that Mircea Eliade and others did, were characteristically people who had had a life-threatening illness. And in the height of that illness, they realized that if they recovered, that they would devote their lives to healing others. And it was that recognition that opened them to the possibility of a numinous healing. And in the Cancer Help Program, which, as you know, we've done for 33 years and 204 retreats, it's often true that wounded healers show up. But I love these four things. Be humble, practice not knowing, see the Buddha in everyone, and bear witness to suffering. Are those, they sound like Four Noble Truths. What are they called in Buddhism, those four practices? Do they have a name, or is that a list that you developed from?
No. It was it's a list that many Buddhist teachers would say to their priests during ordination. And I have heard Norman say it actually also. To disappear into the robe is a way also of that being said.
It's so funny because I often feel that if people don't understand humility as a fundamental reality, that they honestly, at some level, just haven't in any way woken up yet. In other words, that humility is just kind of the ground of being of any realistic appraisal of our place in the universe, that we're at once, tinier than a fleck of sand, and that we contain universes within ourselves. So it's that joint thing of being infinitely tiny. But as you say, that third point, see the Buddha in everyone, including yourself. There's that infinite spaciousness. So that be humble and then not knowing. That Socrates is a great line that when he was told that the oracle at Delphi had said that Socrates was the wisest man in Athens, it was because he knew that he did not know. And what has fascinated me is that Socrates, this is something I need to really trace down, but there is apparently another Platonic dialogue in which Socrates says he knows that he does not know, but there's one thing that he does know, and that is love. and that he is an expert on that. I need to find the reference on that. I've cited it quite a few times, but I need to find the dialogue where... Have you heard that, Mark?
I have, and I don't know which dialogue it is, but I'm reminded that another of my heroes is Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
And she said, very small poem, all I know of love is all there is.
Yeah. Yeah. Which again is one of the... It's not one of the Four Noble Truths, but it is a noble truth.
It is.
At a very deep level. Mm-hmm. Well, I love that list. What a lovely... So that's what's on your heart. Mm-hmm. How beautiful. So you are at a quite extraordinary moment. We're speaking in November 2019, and in January you will enter a experience at Tassajara, and perhaps you could tell us what that is.
So not to be a big knower, but we're in November 2018.
Sorry. Thank you. This is what goes with being 75 years old. It's a lovely thing for which I can completely forgive myself.
Yeah, I'm going to Tassajara on January 5th, and I'll be there through April 4th, along with, I think, about 70 other people for the winter practice period, which they have every year. But this year, for the first time in about 20 years, Norman Fischer will be conducting it. And there will be, during that 3-month period of time, when I will be receiving Shiho, which is a Japanese word for transmission, given from teacher to disciple.
Now, you're being appropriately humble about this, but Shiho is not something that is handed out every day by Zen teachers. Yeah. So it's a true transmission from Norman Fischer, who's a very extraordinary Zen teacher, to you, that enables you to ordain other priests, perform ceremonies. Well, all priests can perform ceremonies. Is that correct? Right.
Yeah, I think that the role of the priest is always to continue on with the ritual in a tradition, and this is a continuation of that continuation. So you are.
So it's a very significant point. It's the point at which a teacher says, "I have transmitted to you what I have found, that you are now free to pass on." And doesn't that, I know not a lot about Zen, but doesn't that also include a responsibility on your part to find and offer others the opportunity to continue the tradition?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a big, in a sense, a big responsibility, right? To raise up other teachers.
He has said it's a blessing and a burden.
Yeah.
And a blessing from the Buddha, and a burden from the weight of the suffering in the world, and finding others who you practice with.
I did a New School conversation with Norman Fischer, who's a most extraordinary man. But tell us and our listeners a little about Norman. Who is he, and what distinguishes his practice of Zen?
Oh, I'm looking at my my friends who also study with him. I'll just tell you that I met Norman in 1982. I was studying and practicing at the Zen community of New York in Riverdale, and we had started a Zen bakery. Many of you have heard of this bakery, started by Bernie Glassman, called the Grayston Bakery. And I was the sales director. Trent, I got in a car every day and went into New York City with cakes and cookies and breads and all sorts of goodies to try and sell them to fancy places. And there was a whole work crew of bakers, people who packaged, people who delivered. And Norman and his wife Kathy came for a year with their young twin boys at that time, taking sort of a break from out here in San Francisco. Norman's mother was ill on the East Coast. They wanted to be able to see her before she died. And Norman was a bread baker and was not someone who I ever would have dreamed that I would be studying with, or who would be such an important, beloved person in my life. He is a very learned, very serious person, a religious scholar and deep practitioner.
And poet.
He's a poet, and it's a kind of poetry that's an acquired taste for many people. It's a language poet kind of. It's a different kind of poetry than I write, or that other people I know write, and it's very much in tune with his Zen practice. And he says, in fact, that it has everything to do with who he is as a Zen practitioner. I would say Norman's one of the most generous beings I've ever met. He's a great listener, and is there whenever people ask for him to be there, which is part of the transmission, as far as I'm understanding it, is that you will be present and be there when people ask.
You were there when I did the spiritual biography with him at his house.
I was.
And I had done a lot of preparation for it, but afterward I felt, I just barely scratched the surface. I just felt like, I didn't feel as if I had been able to really go deep enough. It was an interesting experience.
Well, you used the term before, worlds within worlds inside all of us, and I think with Norman, what any of us feel in his presence is both a sort of regular guyness on the one hand, but really it's worlds within worlds. It's so
He
many.
was the head of San Francisco Zen Center.
He was the abbot there.
He came in at the end of a very tumultuous period of time.
Yeah, he said that actually he feels that everybody else, looked down the line when they were looking for who was the next abbot, and he was the last guy in line.
That's what I remember that story. Yeah. But he did a beautiful job.
He did a beautiful job.
Yeah.
And was part of the healing of that community.
And you lead a Sangha in Point Reyes called the Heart of Compassion Sangha that meets Fridays at 8 a.m. at the Presbyterian Church.
That's correct.
20 to 30 people show up. That's a
Más o menos, yes.
lot of people at 8 a.m. On a Friday. You told me that recently you made a donation to West Marin Community Services, that all the donations go to charity, and you donated sleeping bags, mats, tarps, underwear, socks, and gloves for all the people who are living hard in West Marin.
Yes, people who are living in their cars and people who are in the woods. Yeah, it was this morning, and it's thanks to the Sangha members, some of whom are here. We got to meet with the incredible director of West Marin Community Services, and I anticipate that it's going to be a relationship that we continue to deepen with that organization.
I think a lot about those people. We all think about different things, but I have a proclivity to think about the people who live in cars and trucks and campers and the people. When I go into Berkeley and I take the turnoff for Gilman. There's a place you go left, and there's usually somebody waiting for handouts there. And there's a whole bunch of people who used to live under the bridge there. But then the powers that be cleaned it all out and put up fences and stuff like that. But, in West Marin, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, and people think, oh, everybody is wealthy out there. And actually, the Brighton Avenue is typically lined with cars and vans. And I don't remember, did Bolinas pass or fail the thing about bouncing everybody off Brighton Avenue? What?
Failed.
It failed, so it didn't pass.
Had to be 2/3.
Okay. Yeah, there was an effort, which I understand, particularly of landowners along Brighton Avenue. They didn't like all the people in cars and trucks. But with what's coming down in the world right now, I so deeply believe there are going to be more and more and more people living out of cars and trucks and RV vans. And where are they going to park? And they're going to be chased from one place to another as people get together to chase them away from wherever else it is. So this is actually a big thing for me.
It's a whole part of our world that most of us don't see.
Yeah. I'll tell you something really crazy. I have researched RV parks from Northern California through Alaska because I have a fantasy that as the middle of the country becomes uninhabitable because of the heat and everything else, where are people going to go? They're going to head for the coast. But they're going to be people who can't afford to buy houses. So what are they going to come in? They're going to come in their vans. It's like going to be the Okies, They're going to come in their trucks and vans, and they're going to be trying to find a place to park, right? So what do we need? We need campgrounds and RV parks that are actually designed for people who are looking for community. And with what's coming down, we want solar power and places to do garden beds and set up for community and designed to create community. So anyway, this is, one of my crazy images, but I really believe that we are seeing the future in the people that your Sangha is creating sleeping bags and mats and gloves and socks for. What do people need? They need bathrooms, they need a place to take a shower, they need food, they need access to health care, and they want to be around other people. They don't want to be out in the middle of nowhere. So, there's certain, you could design a set of design criteria for where people will live.
I think that's actually in practice already with West Marin Community Services to a certain extent. But yeah, Michael, we're talking about masses of people on the move around the globe. And in our country, we see it mostly in cities. We don't know that the people are in their tent in the woods the same way we see them under the bridges and at the stoplights in Marin and San Francisco. But all over the world, with forced migration, with people fleeing from horrendous governments and threats of being killed, corporate greed taking over, resources like mines and forests and building hydro dams. Many, many, many people are on the move without shelter, without a sense of home, without security. And if we can turn our consciousness toward that bearing witness kind of practice, I think that we are called to do something. And sometimes it's offering money, and sometimes it's offering just the listening, and sometimes, obviously, action. I'm sort of And I've been very deeply influenced by Richard Rohr and the Center for Action and Contemplation, which was an earlier place I was able to study in my life. And the sort of rebel rousers, I think, have always been very attractive to me in terms of spiritual direction. There are lots of good ones.
Yes, Richard Rohr, for those of you who don't know, is an extraordinary Catholic contemplative who has an incredible website. And I read his little thing every single morning from the Center for Contemplation and Action. He just announced he had cancer again, and that he thought the end of life might be coming closer for him. He is like Brother David Steindl-Rast and, like a handful of others of the great Catholic contemplative activists, truly extraordinary. Coming back to your observation about people being on the move, so you do this deeply. I mean, this is not just an abstraction for you. First of all, at the Tamalpais Trust, you work with these indigenous communities that are trying to protect sacred lands and waters and knowledge and so forth. But also you're involved in other respects in refugee work. And so here's a deep philosophical question I want to ask you. And it truly is a deep question. What's happening with climate change, aside from all the violence and everything else, is that the temperatures around the world are going up. And around the equator, it's going to become more and more difficult to live, and desertification is spreading and all that. So as both violence and corporate takeovers and climate change and, war and everything else does this, you could say a large part of the global south is on the move toward the global north. And the global north is building walls. That's the bigger picture. The global south is on the move out of Africa toward Europe, out of Latin America, toward the United States. And the global north, not just our president, the global north is building walls. So, and I don't expect you to be able to answer this, but I'm just posing, in a sense, for all of us. Most progressives are very compassionate people. They want to welcome refugees with open arms. Many conservatives, I'll take David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, as a reasonable example, ask what the limits of that compassion would be. In other words, I bet that if we asked the people in this room, I bet 90% of whom at least are progressive, that they would want to welcome refugees. But then the follow-up question for me would be, should we have open borders? Should everybody in the world who wants to come to the United States be able to come? And so the deep questions for me is, and maybe you can reflect on this, what is the relationship between compassion for the billions of human beings who are going to want to find their way to refuge and the sense of people who live in northern countries, even very progressive, compassionate people? Yes, we want to be compassionate. Yes, we want to welcome people, but are there limits? And I'm just curious, you're a very thoughtful person. How do you sit in the face of all the suffering with the question of whether our ethical obligation spiritually is to welcome everyone, or whether there are limits to what we can do? That's just an honest question without, I don't know the answer, but I'm curious how you would hold a question like that.
I'm looking for help. Yeah. So I'm very aware that as you're exploring here, that your recent inquiry has been in this Omega work that you've been involved in, which is very interesting to me. I don't know a whole lot about it, but it is of interest to me in terms of the way you may feel the world is turning.
Yeah.
And a sense of ending rather than a sense of beginning or a sense of opening. And my experience in my life has been around there being no limit to the help that's available.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have been inspired by are people who also see no end to opening and giving and being available.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that we are human beings, and that, as somebody said to me when I said something about, having made many mistakes that in my life, that yes, being human is very much a part of those instructions. To really be human and to know that there are going to be moments where you fall asleep on your feet, but that you have much more to offer, and as a collective, that the power of yes, we can is an awesome, unlimited power, as far as I can see. I see that a lot in the indigenous people who I work with, who have completely triumphed in some ways over the move to exterminate them off the face of the earth. And they have done it tenaciously through their identity as a collective, not as individuals. So when I think of, for example, the Haida people, who Mark and I both have been inspired by.
It's Mark Dowie, who wrote a book on the Haida Gwaii, who's here.
Yes.
Right.
The way of life on Haida Gwaii has a lot to do with drawing on the wisdom of the ancestors, the deep faith in worlds invisible to us, and in helpers that are there, people and practices who have been before them for many years, able to sustain life and flourish, actually. They are mighty people. I don't think of them at all as aloof. They are actually kind of right in your face kind of people if you actually get to know them in any sort of way. But they're people who would not know, in a sense, how to limit their caring for the world. So I've been, of course, troubled by all the ways in which we see the walls and the borders and the blockades in our own hearts as well as in the practice in the world. But I have complete faith that is not the bigger power of the world.
Well, that's beautifully said. Let me just fill out some references. You mentioned our work with Omega, and which is a nascent funder, thought partner collaborative on the global challenge of the 25 different vectors that some people are believe are leading towards civilizational collapse. We have a project at Commonweal called the Resilience Project, which is doing the same kind of work. And so let me just start by saying where I agree with you. I agree with you, actually, that the opportunities to be of service are going to be even greater. There's no question about it. And part of our work, Oren and I were just in a board retreat at Commonweal, and we just want forever to be exploring how we can be of the greatest use, because the suffering will increase. And the opportunities, and I actually am one who does not believe this is the end at all. I think humanity is a weedy species, that we have been able to survive from near the North Pole to near the South Pole, and that we will undoubtedly, or very likely, be able to continue to survive. The question is, who's going to survive, and under what conditions, and what will it be like? And will we become transhuman, or will we remain human in some way? Will we become cyborgs? I mean, the first genetically designed twins are being born in China, and so they're now beginning to do germline genetic transformation, and so when I remember years ago when we started the Commonwealth Sustainable Futures Project, and one of the authors of the Brundtland Commission report, James McNeill, came to Commonwealth. He said something I've never forgotten. He said that there were four possible futures: business as usual, descent into chaos, achieving sustainability, or becoming artificial people on an artificial planet. And my observation was that it isn't actually a choice of those four, that it's all four in some combination, to some degree business as usual, to some degree descent into chaos, to some degree becoming sustainable, and absolutely becoming artificial people on an artificial planet. So I don't think it's an and. I think what we're struggling over is to what degree the arc of that set of possibilities moves in directions that as human beings we would wish to have our children and grandchildren born into. So when I pose a question, William James has a great distinction between tough-minded and tender-minded people. And in general, progressives tend to be tender-minded, quote, bleeding heart liberals. And conservatives tend to be tough-minded. And from my point of view, you need both perspectives, because, Gandhi was actually very tough-minded. He was enormously compassionate. But when asked why he knew what the British were going to do next, he said, it's because I'm that kind of scoundrel, And so that capacity to both see where the vectors are headed in order to be able to respond compassionately. So that's why I love your answer, but I do not personally believe that the opportunities for compassion are a sufficient response. And I don't think it's the only response you're taking. You're organizing indigenous peoples around the world, which is a tough-minded thing to do.
Well, but I think that the circle back to, not knowing, and to the quote that was used for this particular conversation about leaving home. I'm convinced that we have to leave behind the habitual ways we have been thinking of any of this, that we don't know, and that there is actually a kind of much deeper wisdom and activity available that's, I'm going to say, interspecies and intercommunication in ways that I hardly even know what I'm talking about, except that I think we're getting all sorts of cues, big signals in our relationships with plants and with the elements, with the ways in which science is pushing and opening and challenging us these days. I don't think we know at all, and that we are pretty distracted right now with what's going on. We're living in a time when, at this moment, I was looking on your bookcase as I came into your office, and I looked at this book. Spine said chaos on it, and I thought, oh yeah, well, that book's out of my reach, and I don't really want to go up there to read it, actually, because it's right here, right in my my sort of front and center place. And at the same time, there is a lot of energy in my own life and in the world around me, I think, being used to say and act in a way that feels not chaotic, not torn asunder. There are people saying, I'm waking up right now in this. This is important for me to see how chaotic and crazy this is. And I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm going to be a part of something deeper and loving and kind. And to be real with each other and not try and hide what hurts.
Well, that's beautiful. And as you know, I deeply agree with all of that. We've been part of that work together for a long time. So, did the Buddha actually say that thing about how people with opinions just went around the world disturbing the peace? Or is that?
I don't know. There's a whole website, the things the Buddha didn't say.
Yeah.
You know that?
Yeah. Right. So, where were you born and where did you grow up?
Where was I born? Well, I was going to say earlier to you that when you were talking about wounded healers and what happens with the encounters with illness, that I was born to a mother who spent 37 years in bed. And though I saw her walk a few times in my life, it was not the way she was for much of it.
What was her condition?
She had very bad rheumatoid arthritis. She then got Parkinson's, and she was what we called in those days manic depressive, quite depressed at some times, but famously manic at other times. I think I learned a lot
Where
from
did you grow
that. Westport, Connecticut, I was born. And my parents were not very young when they married each other, so I was their only child. My father said they moved to, when they first moved, after marrying, they moved to a golf course apartment in Westport. And so he would say to people, she was conceived on a golf course. And people would go, The truth was, I was not conceived on a golf course. But I think I was their only chance.
What was his work?
My father was a billboard salesman. He sold advertising on those big billboards in Times Square. And he always wanted me to go into the sign business.
And you did?
Well, I don't know. I think so.
You saw a sign.
Well, I worked in television for many years, and when I saw that was really the world of samsara for me, I asked for a leave of absence, and
You worked in documentaries?
I worked in news, television news, the ABC News, and I went to my boss, Ruin Arlich, and said that I wanted to take a leave of absence. I wanted to go live in a Zen center. And he said, "You're having a nervous breakdown." I've said before, that I thought it was really a nervous breakthrough because I was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and I was addicted to diet pills. I was very sure that these very serious wars that we were going to cover were places for debauchery based on the journalists not going out of the hotels, staying there, drinking, and getting into trouble together. And I thought, I'm going to go right down the tubes with all of this. I can't do it. So I left TV. And when I did, my father was sure that I had stopped work altogether because my name didn't go up, on the end of the credits anymore. And he said, "Now you're coming into the sign business." I said, no, I'm going into a Zen monastery.
Which Zen monastery did you go to?
Well, it was the Zen community of New York, which was a monastic practice at that time.
Is that where you met Bernie Glassman?
Bernie was my teacher.
Yeah. And how old were you then?
I was 28.
And my memory is that the bakery was no piece of cake. So.
No.
Yeah,
No.
it was really hard.
It was really hard.
Yeah.
We burned out all the Zen students, burned them out twice. We had 2 different whole sort of cohorts. They were all thought this was crazy. And Norman left. Yeah, Norman came back here. He didn't stay. And then we started to train homeless people to be the bakers. And that was quite a challenge. So by that time, I was no longer just selling it. I was baking it and delivering it as well. Yeah.
So did you go from there to the New Mexico Community Foundation?
No, I did not. No.
How did you get?
I went from there back to finish college at age 35. And one of my professors there, who I had previously, before I dropped out to go into the Zen Center, I had been working at ABC News and going to college spare time. And he saw me come back to school to get the final bachelor's degree, and he said, "You're not going back to that monastery." I said, "Well, I don't know what I'm going to do exactly." And he was very helpful and helped me go to graduate school at Johns Hopkins, where I was accepted into the writing program. And on the chance that I could start writing, something I'd wanted to do since I was a little girl, to do it in a regular professional way, I went there. But on my way there, I went to a retreat with Stephen Levine on death and dying. And I met the first person I ever knew with AIDS. It was 1985.
Yeah.
So I began to write when I got to Johns Hopkins about AIDS and the AIDS epidemic. And fell in love and got married and dove into the AIDS epidemic with a new husband. And then moved to New Mexico.
And how long you worked in New York with HIV?
No, we worked in Baltimore with HIV, and then went to New Mexico and started to work. I worked for 10 years in HIV.
In Baltimore and
Baltimore and then New Mexico. Yeah. Yeah, Baltimore, it was a disease of the ghetto. It was a disease of women, black women, many of whom were either sleeping with men who were hustlers or IV drug users. They had no idea what it was they had, actually. It was the beginning of the epidemic. And then there were also migrant workers in those days who were working their way up the East Coast, and the HIV epidemic was full-blown there in the mid-'80s. And they didn't know what they had either.
So did your Zen spiritual practice in any way accompany you through these later
Yeah.
phases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the early teaching about not turning away from what was painful and not, the beginnings with my own parents. My mother's illness, my father had grand mal epilepsy. They were in a terrible marriage with each other. There was lots of drinking and drugging and violence. And I saw that there was also a kind of, again, help available and a lot of love available. And that then became a through line, I think, for me in Zen practice as well, because in my own case, I received so much help. I was really a disaster when I started, and I was hiding it. I was trying, and to be able to not hide and to be able to come out was really a big part of that.
What was the inner source of strength in you that enabled you, before you discovered Zen, to survive your parents' marriage and survive all the changes you went through? What was it in you that enabled you to get through the hard stuff?
Imagination.
Imagination? Imagining what?
Well, I would sit at the end of the driveway and tell myself stories. And throw little rocks into the trees. And the trees became characters in the stories that I would tell myself. And they were often, I don't know where this came from, but I mean, they were often like I was in Africa and there were fantastic elephants and lions, and they were my friends, and we were in the midst of some sort of terrible illness and calamity all around us. And it must have been like an Albert Schweitzer fantasy that I had in some way, or a Mother Teresa early thing. I don't know. I just saw this as a way of being with myself and also being with other beings, animals and trees and the natural world.
When you were a little person, what is the first thing that you remember wanting to be when you were grown up?
I wanted to be what do you call them? The people who tend to the elephants.
An elephant tender.
In the circus, yeah. I wanted to live in those places behind the big top.
Yeah. Behind the big tent.
Yes.
So these would be circus elephants that you would tend.
Yeah.
Can you remember one of the stories that you told yourself when you sat at the edge of the lake and threw pebbles?
Well, I actually have the first story I ever wrote. I was 5, and I typed it on my mother's typewriter. And it was a story of 2 little girls, and it was really me and my best friend, and that we rode our bicycles by a house that was on fire, and we went in and rescued a baby and wrapped her in wet rags and brought her home, and she was my little sister after that.
What a beautiful story.
Wow.
So you kept the Zen, you discovered, so Zen in a sense saved your life.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what saved my life about it was that I said to Bernie Glassman, how do I get out of this? And he said, you go right into the middle of it.
A wise and ancient teaching.
Yes.
And you were 20?
I was 28 when I
28.
went there, and I was almost 35 when I left.
Do you remember a moment in that 7-year period that kind of encapsulates it vividly for you?
Oh, God, Michael. Well, I do remember I have told others this story, but there was a little old Roshi who came to visit us from Japan, Nishiwaki Roshi, and he was the head of the big sort of mothership Soto headquarters in Japan, and I was assigned to drive him around in the car and take him to see all these other Zen centers where the teachers had to put on a big sort of do to have him there. And after we'd been to 4 or 5 of these places, and he was very excited because he said, Zen is alive in America. The question in the old country is dead. There's no excitement there anymore. We were driving along one day, and we were pretty familiar with each other at this point. And he asked me where I was in my koan practice. And koan practice, people know, is a way of mostly rinzai practice of impossibly unsolvable questions that you're asked as a Zen student. And there are 3,000 or 4,000 of them that people can do in a systematic way, and it's supposed to help free your mind from knowing. So this man had such a freedom, delight in being alive about him. So he said, where are you in your koan practice? And I was like, well, I'm not too good at this. I'm sort of at the beginning, and I know I'm never going to finish in my lifetime. And then I thought, well, I can dare myself to ask him this. Maybe we'll see what he'll share with me. I said, can you tell me the last koan? Because I know I'll never get there. And he said, I won't tell you the last koan, but I will tell you the answer to the last koan. And David, you think I said one thing, and I think I said another, but I'm just going to say that I thought, hot damn, this is great. I'll never get there otherwise. And he said the last answer to the koan is love.
Mm.
Is that what you heard me say, David?
No, but I'm sure you have. I'm sure you.
What did you hear? What did you hear, David?
I heard that the answer to all the koans
Yes.
is love.
Yeah. Well,
What's the matter?
we can go with
Same,
either of those.
Same, yeah. It did assure me, that that this was the practice that for me, I wasn't going to ever get to the end of, and that love was, in fact, the answer to all of it. But I'd never heard anyone use that word in our Zen practice at that point. It was, in the early 80s. When I started to practice with Norman in 2009, one of the first talks he gave, he mentioned something about love. I was like, wow, look at that. Yeah. And I said to him in one of my first meetings, I'm so grateful to you. You're talking about love. And those who know Norman, it took me long enough. That it was not something that we talked about, and that it was a real opening in the American understanding and practice of Zen to be talking about love.
Actually, it's so interesting because the next question that I was going to ask you before you said that was, what have you learned from love in this lifetime?
Now there's a small question for you. Well, it's easy to love when people are lovable. It's easy to love when the atmosphere is there and there's great comfort. And the most profound experiences I've had have been around when I thought I couldn't love anymore, or when I was so sure that something that had happened that was I couldn't forgive. And suddenly, boing, something springs open, and it's possible to go beyond that. Endless reservoir, always available. That's what I've learned.
So I learned more from love than from anything else in my life, and talked about it.
You're a love bug.
I'm a love bug. You're a love bug too, aren't you? Yeah, two love bugs up here. But clearly there are different kinds of love, right?
Yes.
So there's in love, right? That ecstatic state that some of us have experienced in this lifetime, right? There's love of a brother or sister or a spiritual brother or sister or a parent or a child. There's love of our work. There's love of the natural world. There's love of the Dharma, the truth, this divine love. How do you hold, when you say, how do you hold these different forms of love in any kind of understanding? What is the story you tell yourself about the relationship between these different kinds of love?
Well, you're the one who's talking about different kinds of love.
Excuse me?
I said, you're the one who's talking about different kinds of love.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
You say it's all the same?
So, well, I wouldn't say it that way, that it's all the same, but I wouldn't parse it
Oh, okay.
in some way. I would just say that the different expressions of the love continue to astound me.
Mm-hmm.
And that the older I get, the more I appreciate that the opportunity to be known and to be intimate is a kind of love that I thought perhaps as a younger person was only available and meant for certain beings and certain experiences in my life. No more. I really feel it much more now in all kinds of experiences that I have. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. And so, since you started studying again and you renewed your vows in 2009 with Norman Fischer, your teacher who has this beautiful Zen project called Everyday Zen, it's now almost 10 years, and now you're going to take this Shiho full transmission from him at Tassajara in January of 2019. Can you say something about what that 10 years of intense practice and studying with Norman Fischer has been for you? How have you moved in your spiritual biography over the last 10 years of this work?
Norman is a teacher of ethics, and I have always felt that his straightforward integrity is something that inspires me to try and bring that forward in my own life. He once told us that one of the things he likes to do when he goes to public washrooms is to leave them nicer than when he went in. And it's been a big teaching for me. I love to do that now too. And I think of him each time I do that. It just encapsulates for me what it is to be able to be around someone with a kind of sensitivity to others. And no one thanks him for those kinds of, actions. And to be that person in the world who can disappear without needing applause and without needing a lot of attention. What you were saying earlier in the conversation, we live in this world of great celebrity and of people needing to be famous. And how amazing it is when people don't want to be that. There is so much more to give when we're not worried about our reputation and how famous we are. So for Norman, though he is so well known, there is something so humble and so sort of right as rain about him that I just feel lucky to be his student. I want to add something in terms of practice with Everyday Zen, the appreciation for Sangha, which...
Sangha meaning community.
Community, yes, community of people who I practice with, my teachers, my friends, my beloveds who I get a chance to be around and who share and give of themselves, again, often without being seen and called out for it.
Your family of choice, right? We're given our families of birth and then we create our families of choice. Yeah.
Well, and how fortunate I feel to be in that family.
Yeah.
People who also chose each other.
So you've talked about Norman's practice, you've talked about your gratitude for the Sangha, the community, but my real question was, what has happened to you internally as a result of this?
I think it's kept me I want to say going in the right direction for the purpose of my life instead of getting detoured.
Yeah.
I'm kind of a fun hog. I really like to play, and I could have been diverted in big ways, I think. Maybe I'm being too hard on myself, I don't know, but I
You're approaching 40 years of practice.
I am at 40 years of practice.
Yeah. That's something.
Well, I was pretty messed up too, Michael, and I felt like it was something that took a dramatic, radical effort on my part to sort of turn the wheel, or be turned by the wheel. I had obviously a lot of health. Also, you asked, how did I get through the early years? Yeah, I was born with some kind of deep health. But I had a lot of bad habits, and I really thought I was a wretch. So turning that around and understanding that that Quaker saying, I have it hanging on my refrigerator, ask simply to be used. I've always
I
felt,
love that. I didn't know that line.
yeah,
I adore that. Ask simply to be used.
Yeah.
I just love it. You know the Naomi Shihab poem, Famous?
I do.
That can't quote it by heart, but the last line's about, I want to be like a pulley or a buttonhole, not because they are ever famous, but because they never forgot what they were good for. Isn't that beautiful? And for me, to be useful is the center of the whole thing. So I didn't know. Ask only to be useful. Isn't that
Ask
beautiful?
only to be used. Ask simply
Used.
to be used.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
It's a good, was there something more representative of Quakerism than that?
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
How long did it take you, if you felt like you were a wretch when you were 28 and went into Zen practice, how long did it take you to develop another perspective? I mean, we're all wretches, but how long did it take you to discover that you weren't only a wretch?
Only a wretch?
Yeah.
I think I knew that going in there.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I think I did. But I felt that it was it's pretty dicey. I was on the edge. I was working in television, and everybody there was pretty caught up in what do you look like, how much money do you make, what fancy assignment did you have, and there were very few women, so I was a token woman to begin with, and a lot of pressure in terms of all those kinds of questions on me. And I have been, in many ways, a woman in men's world often in my life, yeah. So that's been a big part of my evolution, especially, I think, in this last 10 years. The Me Too movement has stirred a lot of old memories. I was very lucky. I did not get raped and I didn't get groped, but I have been in some very dangerous situations, and I have been humiliated and silenced and passed over.
I remember, I'm not going to cite the example, but you told me once about a person we both know who just didn't see you as a human being, which astonished me. So these things aren't just past events, they go on.
But it's thrilling to be part of the consciousness
Yes,
that is opening now
yeah,
for women and men,
yeah.
and the chance for the healing of gender.
And it's gone global in such an amazing way. It's not just a US, EU phenomenon. I mean, you see it in Asia. I don't know if you see it in Africa, maybe so. But
Yes.
you see it in Africa?
Yeah, I'll tell you one example. So the women I work with in Kenya who are pastoralist women, they live with their animals and they go on migration trails. The trails are often 3 to 5 years long. And the little girls were often considered by the patriarchy to be extra. And they would sometimes be tied to some immovable, there aren't many trees in that area, but something where they couldn't leave, and they would die from exposure and starvation, or believe it or not, a father would arrange for the little girl to be raped on the path, and then she would be shunned, and he could leave her and not support her any longer. So the women, this is an area of the world where women are 100% part of the female genital mutilation practice, which is a complicated issue for them. They are trying to change that in their way, but they are particularly clear that they have to save their daughters first before they can even think about themselves. So they have begun a practice that's now quite well established over the last 3 or 4 years. They build these schools that look sort of like little thatch roofed, almost like igloos, that have flat floor of sticks of wood, and then leaves that cover the roof. And they take 4 women at a time, each with a corner of the wood posts on their shoulders, so that they can go along the migration trail. And the little girls are up in this little schoolroom. That's what they call it. It's a traveling schoolroom. And they've gotten so cool about it now. They have a greenhouse, a solar greenhouse on top of these things. And they're growing vegetables for the first time, which is kind of unheard of in northern Kenya. There's nothing really green there. And so they're teaching the girls, they're protecting them. They're doing these solar greenhouses, and they're bringing a kind of spirit and resilience into the life of women. It's just fantastic.
Say more about the work with Tamalpais Trust, because it's an extraordinary piece of work, and you're also part of a wonderful philanthropic collaborative on protecting truth speakers who are getting shot all over the world.
Environmental defenders.
Yeah, environmental defenders. But
Yeah.
say a little about the Tamalpais Trust and the environmental defenders work.
Well, Tamalpais Trust is a 20-year philanthropic trust. We're in year 7. I've been with it since it was launched, and the donors have designated funds for the next now 13 more years to Indigenous-led organizations around the world. They're large grants, general support grants, not project grants, so that people can stabilize their organizations. And they're being given to help protect sacred lands and waters, traditional knowledge systems, youth and women leadership changes, and Indigenous rights.
Where have you made grants?
We made grants in Nicaragua, Honduras, Mexico, throughout the Arctic, Canada, and also in Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Russia, the Sami people there, Mongolia, New Zealand, Peru, Bolivia, Chile.
And you've traveled to all these places.
I have traveled to a lot of them,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And when you said large grants, what is the magnitude and what is the time frame?
Well, so these are long-term grants. So far, most of our grant partners have been getting the grants for 7 years. They range between $300,000 and $500,000 a year.
A year?
A year,
That's substantial.
yeah, it is substantial.
So between $300,000 and $500,000 a year for 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, that's substantial. And so,
Yes,
what has your experience been of the impact of the grants on these Indigenous organizations? Because you and I have been in philanthropy long enough to know that it's not entirely obvious that grants of those magnitudes to Indigenous communities will be of benefit necessarily. I mean, in other words, we certainly know there are famous cases where foundations have flooded a field with money and the impact has been destructive rather than constructive. So I'm just curious, as you thought about giving these grants to Indigenous communities, did you have to think about how they would be utilized, what the impact would be, and what you discovered.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the only way you do this. is
Right.
that
So what did you learn?
I learned the same thing I've learned from many years of doing this, is that you must go and visit.
Yeah.
You must have the kind of relationship of trust and openness. You must expect that it will not be what you think it's going to be, and that they are under incredible pressure, but that there's genius there, especially with ways of knowing and learning how to take care of the earth in particular, and often how to take care of each other without romanticizing it. That there is really a body of practice and cultural strength that you don't have to dig very deep. It's right there. It's a very different scene outside the U.S., which is where we work, than it is inside the U.S. And I have worked inside in Native America previous to this job. And there's some things I could tell you why I think the differences are so great, but there's a lot more solidarity and connectedness in the international movement. And some of it is around the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which took about 38 years to have, what do I want to call it, ratified, but there's no enforcement even of that, that document. And what they've done is they've decided, okay, there's no legal enforcement. That doesn't mean that we're not going to do something with it. So they've been doing education for international attorneys, for heads of state, for doctors, for people who are in governmental agencies all over, to teach them about free, prior, and informed consent, which is a phrase that if you look at it one word at a time, free, the community is free to be involved or not to be involved. Informed, they must be completely informed, not superficially informed. They have to be able to have prior knowledge rather than just be surprised and expected to have it be, okay, you make your decision on whether this is okay today. And then consent, it started out being, what was the other word? It was consulted, that they needed to be consulted. Well, that left a lot of room for there to be someone who came in and said, you know, Michael, I'm going to tell you about X, and then leave. It didn't mean that there was consent, and you could check off the list, yes, we consulted. So these 4 words and this policy has changed the international scene for indigenous territories and people who are under siege now more than ever, especially in places like the Amazon, where the huge dams and the deforestation have terrible consequences for the whole earth. And those are our hope, are the people who are holding perhaps the fate of the earth in many ways in their activism. So the Environmental Defenders Collaborative is a group of 14 foundations now joining together to support people who are being threatened, who are being maimed and killed and run off their land. And it's a small
Extraordinary
expression.
work.
It is extraordinary.
Yeah. Our friend Mark Dowie is sitting here, and my last conversation was with him about the Haida Gwaii. And as you listen to our friend Jaune talk about her work, what would you add about Jaune's contribution to this
Oh, Michael,
field?
don't do that.
I just did it.
I know. I mean,
Well, you and I know, I think, the world of her and everything that she's done for the last 40 years and or more. But I have nothing to add to what she just said about Indigenous people. She understands the situation way better than I do, much more exposed to it. I have spent quite a bit of my life out there in Indigenous communities, and I've learned pretty much what she's telling you about it. I do believe that there are actually right now, aside from the people who are organizing around the UN, there are about 300 lawyers in the world who are committed to litigating on behalf of Native people in different communities. There are about 2,500 communities in the world right now that are in one way or another struggling for sovereignty and title and self-determination. And there are a lot of very committed lawyers who are basically working pro bono, getting some grant money to help them do it. And to me, that's where the future is. It has to be legal and it has to be fought.
Thank you.
Well, and as Michael was saying earlier about the global south trying to come north, I think also we must not forget that the far north is melting. And we are working with many communities now who are needing to move. Whole communities needing to actually pick up their homes to go where they're not sure. They don't have money. There's no one offering them land. But their home places are not only sinking with the water rise, there are gases coming out of the earth that have never before come out of the earth because the deep freeze has melted as well. So it poisons people.
I would actually modify Michael's scenario a little bit. I don't see it as south to north. I see it as equatorial region, both south and north. The southern cone of South America right now is experiencing what we're experiencing. Southern Africa is getting migration from the sub-Saharan Africa is getting from the Sahara. Australia and New Zealand are getting migrates. They weren't expecting it. So it's equatorial region moving north and south.
That's a wonderful correction, and I need to change my language about that. Thank you.
That's your scenario.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from at least one of Jaune's longtime friends who's here. Who would like to say a word about your experience of knowing Jaune for a long time? Somebody who's known her for a long time.
You want me to say something?
Yeah. Say your name, please.
My name is Andrea Jacoby.
Yeah.
Jaune and I used to commute to our Wednesday night seminars when she lived in San Francisco. I would pick her up, and we called it the Dharma bus. And on the way there and on the way back, we would be talking about what we'd heard from Norman. It was a rich experience because you could process what we had just learned. And I think that really cemented our relationship, was becoming Dharma sisters in that way.
Thank you.
So, and the Buddha said that the most important thing was to have spiritual friends. So I feel very fortunate that we've been spiritual friends.
Thank you. Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
I've heard her HIV stories, and
You're a physician.
I'm a physician. Have been involved with HIV and other things in San Francisco. Jaune's stories about connection with the people that had HIV at the very beginning and their families are stunning, exemplary. Her ability to connect and follow through and love. Quite astounding.
Yeah. And who is somebody who's been in Jaune's Sangha in Point Reyes for a while and knows her in that relationship?
Or you.
I have. It's, what I would say about it is that the opportunity for intimacy has been a rollicking success in Point Reyes. We were already a community that likes to meet on that level, and the way we've formed as a group, just I'm scared how many people are going to be attracted to it in the long run. But I'm not very scared, because as it has grown, it doesn't seem to be becoming less intimate, which is very lovely.
Thanks.
A couple of other comments or questions from people who've known Joan. Yeah.
When is your memoir coming out?
Soon.
You've written it.
I have written it, and I just have to put it together.
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
Do you have a title yet? Others? Kate, you have any reflections?
There are lots of things I could say about myself and my relationship to Jean, but I think probably the hallmark is her that I am so touched by her ability to hold what she talked about today, both the witnessing of pain and the experiencing of pain, and the fragility, but and the enduring fragility of joy and fun and hope and love, and so Jean brings both to whatever. Wherever she is today, and at dinner or the sangha, and a willingness to share that vulnerability with us. So I'm very, very grateful.
Oren, you've been friends with Joan for a long time, and as we've said, she recommended you to come to Commonweal and be our executive director. What reflections do you have?
It hasn't been that long, it's been 5 years.
Yeah.
Though it feels like it's a deep knowing that goes a lot beyond. And, when you get to know someone through a slice, to me, Jean is someone we talk about art and and many other things, and her Zen practice was actually not core to our relationship. So it's fascinating to hear all that, and I'm sitting here and wondering how, it's almost a question, it's like as you travel among different communities that are not Zen communities, all the indigenous cultures, including in Central Asia, how does that practice become evident in those relationships in places that are not in the same background?
Well, that is a question that is asked often in the team I work with, and it is about continuing to try and say yes and to be generous. It's easy to close down, especially when you're asked all the time for something, and when it has to do with money, it gets very tricky. You have to remember that though it's tempting to think that we are better off because we're not asking for the money. In fact, we all have the need for money and the need for feeling safe and for taking care of our families. And I've been incredibly privileged. I feel that privilege more and more the older I get, knowing that there are many people who at this stage have a lot more worries than I do. And I see that the the resources, the money and other things that we've all thought perhaps were guaranteed in our lives, education, a safe neighborhood, fresh water coming out of the tap, all that. It's all changing, and if you can remember that you don't really know what's going on really with somebody, and if you can remember to be humble and open, keep opening, be generous. That seems to be the way to continue to do this work. And you guys do it here all the time.
Tell us about the robe that you've been stitching by hand.
The robe that I've been stitching by hand. I have friends here, particularly Andrea, who has helped me quite a lot. She's a wonderful sewer. I am not. I have told people that when my sewing teacher, who's at the San Francisco Zen Center, sees what I bring in week after week, she looks at the stitches and says, "Oh, you're getting so much better, Jaune." And I say, "Those are Andrea's stitches. They're not mine. Mine are really bad." I flunked apron in the home ec classes that we took. I did. I got an F on my apron. I was good in the shop, but I was not good in the sewing thing. It's been a wonderful practice. I love it. And I'm going to wear my robe with all my mistakes for many years to come now.
But tell people what it's about.
Well, it's a meditative practice of sewing your own robe, the same kind of robe that the Buddha wore out of scraps of cloth, which originally came from searching through charnel grounds and taking the clothing off of bodies. Monks then stitched those to cover themselves. At some point, King Ashoka, I believe, asked the Buddha to design robes or some sort of clothing that would distinguish the Buddhist monks from the other wandering ascetics. And the Buddha said, "No, I don't really think we want to make them special." And the king asked him again and again, and finally one day the Buddha was walking with his wonderful assistant Ananda, and they came to the top of a hill and looked out over the rice fields of India. It was probably Nepal, India these days. And the Buddha was so impressed by how beautiful the rice fields were that he said, "Let's make them look like this. Let's make them look like rice fields. We'll make these little mini sort of robes." And that's what now you see around a Buddhist priest's neck is a small representation of the larger robe that looks very much like what a rice field looks like. Beautiful and simple and a kind of natural form that seems very much like who I think the Buddha must have been.
So the deal is, as I understand, that in order to take Shiho, the full transmission and authorization from Norman Fischer, part of the ceremony is that you have to stitch this robe, right?
It is.
And that there are said to be 5,000 stitches in the robe. And that, as you said, you're a terrible sewer, stitcher.
And there are probably 4,000 terrible stitches in it. But there are 1,000 beautiful ones that my friends have done.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that, as a last reflection, you'd like to add, or simply a last reflection to leave us with?
I want to remember my parents. Who really did their best and who lived with a lot of pain and suffering, and obviously loved me a lot, though I couldn't always appreciate that while they were alive. And to say that somehow I feel that there's a way in which we are all challenged to go deep into ourselves, to see the Buddha and bring the Buddha forth. And that sometimes, as you said earlier, Michael, illness and wounds and great difficulties are what brings that forward through the cracks, to bring out the light and bring in the light. And that I'm grateful to not have to make it perfect. Just be whoever I am. Thank you.
Do you have either one of your poems or a fragment of one of your poems that you could leave us with?
I am that woolly auburn cub doing the one sock dance in the garden of autumn. See me turn, turn and turn, inside out, disappear.
Jaune Evans, poet, visual artist, Buddhist priest, and laborer in the fields, the difficult fields of philanthropic work, and above all, beloved friend to so many of us in your family of choice. Thank you for being with us at the New School.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.